He had come for a quick meal and a quiet corner, and the mess hall gave him neither, as the air swelled with a slow current that felt like static and everyone could feel it. Rye's trays slid along metal rails, and the cooks watched with narrowed eyes. And the line moved in jittering bursts, as if people were stepping across an unseen fault and testing for cracks. Ethan took a place where he could see his squad and the other table, and he kept count in his head the way he did before a drill, because the routine steadied him almost as much as the food. Maya sat a little turned away from the aisle so she could watch without inviting someone to call it a stare, and her team kept their talk level, and even as glances bounced, like thrown pebbles, across water. The change in fitness scores hovered like a cloud they could not ignore, and every rumor had a tail that swished just out of reach, and the more they reached, the further it drew away, which only made every whisper feel like a clue. Some of the men said the standard had been bent for the women, and some of the women said the administrators had been swapping numbers to make themselves look efficient, and no one trusted an explanation that came without proof, and the proof was always on a phone that had died or a screen that had gone dark. On the steam table, the pasta stuck to itself, and the sauce bubbled in fitful pops, and a cook leaned on a ladle like a staff while counting trays as if something about the count would keep. The peace that wavered above the room. The supply cart squeaked in on a wheel that had lost its coat of grease, and a crate sat on top with a stencil that read, "Women Only," and the letters looked pleased to be the center of attention as silence pooled. At the base of the cart, Maya measured the crate with a practiced eye and saw the fraction of volume that matched medical supplies and extra uniform pieces, and she told herself to hold that simple fact like a stone in a river while the current tried to drag her into older memories. Ethan saw the same crate and thought of last week when a box for the male barracks had carried spare boots that went missing, and he felt the tug of frustration like a thread wrapped around a finger growing, tight enough to sting. The room balanced on a moment so thin it could have cut skin, and a private from the male table bumped a knee on the bench, and his tray chattered against the metal, and a fork bounced away and landed near a pair of boots that did not step back. Eyes lifted and held wherever they landed, and no one wanted to be the first to look down, and no one wanted to be the first to speak. And that silence braided itself into something firmer than a shout. Maya lifted a hand, and her squad calmed by degrees, and she marked the faces across the gap and read them like a map of shallow waters, where a single wrong step would turn a wade into a full swim, with current pushing hard. The wrong way, Ethan told his team to sit tight without having to say the words, because he had trained them to watch his posture, and they watched it the way they watched a horizon for smoke, as he placed a palm flat on the table, as if he were smoothing a wrinkle that would not go away. The supply specialist, who pushed the cart, cleared a path with a tap of her boot, and the box rocked and nearly slid, and someone from the back moved to steady it, and then stopped, when 3 sets of eyes cut in at once and told them to leave it be. A poster on the wall told them to hydrate and train and respect, and the words looked tired compared to the weight of the room, and the smile on the graphic soldier looked like it had been printed for a different day altogether. A fan near the ceiling ticked at a rhythm that did not match the hum of the lights, and that offbeat tone worked under the skin of the moment like a grain of grit, and everyone felt it even if no one would name it out loud. Maya remembered a run at dawn where the fog had sat low over the track, and someone had sworn they heard the scoreboard beeping after hours, and she had filed it away as a strange thing, until those whispers today tried to tie that sound to a change that might not have been. Clean Ethan remembered a meeting where the admin officer spoke in stiff phrases that never quite answered the one question everyone held in their chest, and the memory lodged like a pebble in a boot, where each step reminded him of the thing he had not resolved, the crate with the women. Only stencils seemed to grow heavier just by sitting there, and the cart tilted and the wheel squeaked again, and the sound ran down every spine like cold water, and the cooks kept serving because if they stopped serving, then the part of the day that made sense would stop too. A corporal at the mail table leaned forward with elbows close to the edge the way a sprinter leans into a start, and he said something that did not carry, but his mouth shaped a word that could have been special and could have been separate, and either way it drew a tiny line that others noticed. A specialist at the female table folded her arms and tilted her head, and she looked like someone who had been told to wait and had waited as long as she could bear, and the tips of her fingers drummed on her sleeve where no one could hear it over the hum. Yet somehow everyone did. Maya took a breath and tasted pepper and metal and the faint sweetness of canned fruit, and she found the center of herself that had not been shaken by drills or storms, and she held it where it could keep her from being pulled into the undertow of old stories. Ethan ran a count of names through his head like a roll call. He had repeated 100 times, and each name steadied him until he reached one that floated just out of reach, because that soldier had been at the training office late last night, and he did not know why. The door to the corridor stood open, and the day beyond looked washed out and thin through the glass as if the outside world had been wrapped in gauze, and the hall itself felt more real than the sun and the sky, and that made the room feel like a place where choices would harden and never quite soften again. Somewhere a plastic cup popped as it settled, and the sound snapped a few heads around, and the tension leaped from point to point across the room like a spark that had not yet found dry grass but was eager to try. The supply specialist wiped her palms on her uniform and glanced at the counter, where the head cook nodded once toward the back office, and that tiny exchange traveled along the edge of every table as if someone had yelled, even though no one had. Maya watched the female squad as they kept their backs straight and their chins level, and she saw in them the same stubborn wire that ran through her, and she wondered how much of this day would bury itself inside their training and rise later when they least wanted it. Ethan watched his team as they made themselves broader or quieter by inches, the way soldiers do when they do not want to be the ones who flinch, and he caught the eye of one who looked away too quickly, and that told him a thread was already tangled somewhere close. The crate shifted as the cart rolled over a seam in the floor, and the stencil flashed in the fluorescent light, and it looked less like a label and more like a dare, and it hung between the tables, like a question that wanted to settle in a throat and choke the answer, a private. From the male side stood as if pulled up by a rope, and a sergeant from the female side stood in the same heartbeat, and the benches scraped, and the sound slid across the tile like steel against ice, and it made the hair on the arms of more than one person rise. Maya stepped into the space with a look that said, "Not yet," and her team eased an inch backward, but kept their gaze locked, and the air seemed to thicken as a current that had been water turned to syrup and then to something with teeth that pressed into the skin of the moment. Ethan stood too, and he did not clap or shout, because he knew better than to add a drop to a bucket that was about to spill, and he simply held his hands open at his sides, and the motion caught, because 3 men at his table matched it without needing to think. Someone in the back laughed in a way that was not funny and not mean, but frayed, and it cut through the room like the sharp edge of a box lid, and it left a curl of quiet behind it, and the quiet wrapped itself around every move and made it heavy. The floor seemed to tilt a breath to the left as if the building itself were leaning into here, and the cheap lights flickered and then held, and the fan ticked again, and the moment stretched, like wire that hummed before it snapped. A cook whispered to another cook who reached for a radio that was not on his belt, and both of them looked up at the same square in the ceiling where a faint grill perched and a faint dust halo ringed it, as if words had been stored behind it for a long time. Maya lifted her chin and focused on that grill as if she could open it herself just by looking, and she felt her team focus with her as if an invisible hand had flattened their attention into a single spear pointed upward at a target. They could not see. Ethan shifted his weight, and the heel of his boot found a sticky patch of coffee that someone had spilled earlier, and the slight give under his foot made him think of mud and training, grounds, and the way a step can sink deeper than expected when the ground is not what it appears. The supply cart rolled the last inches toward the serving counter and then stopped with a small shudder that everyone felt in their bones, and the crate rocked once and steadied, and the wheels squeaked, and the sound hung like a note waiting for the next bar to begin. A wind nobody felt passed like an idea across the faces in the room, and shoulders lifted and spines straightened, and not a single person chose that moment to cough or scrape a chair, because they were all listening for something they did not want and did not want to miss. The grill vibrated with a breath of sound that might have been static and might have been a soft intake, and the mess hall became the kind of place where a flock of birds might choose to take off all at once and leave the trees shaking after they were gone. Maya felt the first syllable of a word build in the air like thunder in the distance, and she marked the faces that would change first when it was spoken, and she braced without moving, so the energy would break around her instead of through her. Ethan felt the same. Rise like a wave that would crest and crash and leave the shoreline different, and he kept his eyes on the people who would reach for someone or something when the water came, and he set his stance to hold the line. Before it could fray, the grill shivered once more, and the lights seemed to lean closer, and the entire hall gathered itself into a single held breath as the voice finally began to form in the wires above their heads, and the first unfinished word slid into the room like a blade, held just shy of the skin, and every eye lifted as the warning they had not expected began to arrive. The clip hovered on the frozen door, and the hush in the hall deepened until the air felt like a glass sheet stretched to the limit. And someone at the edge of the crowd began to shape a name with their mouth and stopped as the ceiling speakers breathed in like lungs ready to speak. The audit voice returned with the same blank tone, instructing all personnel to hold position for verification. And the locks on the doors hummed and clicked once more, as if they were testing their own resolve, and the echo slipped through the room like a scout seeking the first sign of disobedience. Faces tipped toward the phones again, and the shadow on. The screen looked taller now than smaller as the brightness shifted, and someone insisted they recognized the stance, while another swore the outline was a trick of the camera, and each certainty struck sparks that fell between the two tables where the floor waited for heat. Maya raised her palm, and the female squad steadied, and she told them to keep their voices even and their hands clear, while her eyes traced every shoulder at the male table, and Ethan matched her motion without words, and his team read the signal and held as their jaws tightened under the weight of the stare that passing seconds kept piling up. The head cook moved down the serving line with a set of trays and placed them with care, as if equal weight on every side might keep the room from listing, and his helper watched the crowd like a lookout on a bow and called out to settle down, and was swallowed by the tide of whisper and breath that refused to calm. The supply specialist rolled the cart a little forward, and the crate with the stencil leaned toward the light, and the letters looked bold and simple, and also like a dare, and a private from the male side took half a step as if to test the balance of the world, and 3 boots from the female side shifted to meet that same point. Halfway phones lifted higher, and someone rewound the clip by dragging a thumb, and the video stuttered and caught, and the keypad beside the training office door gave off a pale glow, and a shape of a sleeve slipped into view, and then out again so quickly that the room groaned as if it had seen a truth and lost it in the same breath. The voice above repeated the audit notice in the same flat cadence, and it felt less like an order and more like a metronome marking beats that none of them could change, and the rhythm crept into shoulders and spines until people were swaying almost without knowing, like trees in a wind they would not admit was there. A corporal near Ethan said that the figure moved like someone who had been on the obstacle course too often, and a specialist near Maya countered that it was the height of a person from the other team, and both groups stiffened, and an unseen thread pulled tight across the gap, while the cooks glanced at the clock and found no help in its hands. Ethan told his team that the only way out was through with calm, and that meant eyes open and mouths closed, and he looked to Maya, and she gave the smallest nod, and he felt the room tilt just enough to tell him that Something was about to roll, and the first thing to roll would likely be Control-A Private at the rear, called out to play the sound from the clip, and the volume crawled up on several phones at once, and the training office hallway hissed in tinny. Audio with the buzz of a vent and the soft press of fingers on plastic keys, and then the clip crackled and faltered, and the sound died at the moment when they needed it most. The supply clerk near the cart kept saying he had seen a woman leave that corridor after lights out, and a janitor near the dish pit muttered that he had seen a man pacing there, and the contradictions stacked into a wall that both sides wanted to push over and neither side wanted to be caught beneath the crate once. More scraped the metal of the cart as the wheel turned, and the word women seemed to loom larger than the pine slats, and a sergeant from the mail table told the clerk to open it if the audit needed it, and the clerk hesitated with a hand hovering above the lid as if touching it would turn the room into a fuse. Maya stepped forward with a clear voice and said, "No one opens anything without the audit team present," and her team drew a line with their posture rather than their hands, and Ethan mirrored it, and the pause that followed was longer than it should have been, and heavy enough to press tracks into the minds of everyone who felt it. Settle, a new alert chimed from the message thread, and heads dipped and rose as if choreographed, and an anonymous account posted a text that urged them to check the door logs from the training office, and a murmur rolled over the room like a low storm, and the supply specialist swallowed and said the logs could be accessed only with permissions. She did not hold. Another message landed, saying the scoreboard system kept a mirror of keypad events, and half the room had not known that, and the other half pretended they had, and thumbs moved fast, and a link appeared to the shared server, and someone said they had a password, and someone else said they did not trust that source, and yet the link opened anyway. The scoreboard interface loaded in staggered fragments on the small screens, and a login box waited like a locked hatch on a ship, and a soldier at the back shouted. He had the credentials since he had cleanup duty on timing equipment, and everyone stared at him, and he dug through his pocket and pulled out nothing that could help them yet. The cook banged a tray down a little too, hard, and winced, and then steadied it, and the crash rang in the space where a name might have been spoken aloud, and that silence grew its own edges sharp enough to cut, and everyone kept touching their phones as if the warmth of the device could hold them in one piece. At last the logs appeared in a set of plain lines with stamps of times that meant very little, until one entry near midnight flashed brighter than the rest, and a code tag that did not belong to any single person glared back at them like a mask, and the room sucked in the change in pressure that always comes right before a storm breaks. The male squad said the tag matched a code held by supply, and the female squad said the tag matched a code posted to the admin notice. Bored for weeks, and both claims sounded correct enough to be dangerous, and the gap between tables grew full of words that would not help, and breaths that came faster than they should. A chair leg scraped loud, and two soldiers rose in the same heartbeat, and pointed across at each other, and neither spoke a name because they did not need to, and the distance between them seemed to narrow, though neither took a step, and the floor felt like a drawbridge halfway up, with water rushing below. Maya moved into that slim space, and Ethan moved with her, and they did not touch anyone, but they changed the path of motion simply by standing where everyone wanted to push, and the crowd slowed and pressed outward along the walls, while the speaker above clicked once, like a throat about to say something new. The audit voice did not return, and a different static crawled into the grill, and a rough breath rose inside the wires as if someone else had taken the line and was deciding whether to use. It and the soldiers looked up with the same kind of fear that a person feels when a door they thought was locked begins to open by itself. A private near the window muttered that he knew who the shadow was, and he started to say the name, and then choked on it because the courage broke under the weight of so many eyes, and he swallowed again and tried to speak, and nothing came out, and the moment stretched thinner and thinner until it formed a tremble at the edges. The scoreboard log refreshed, and the midnight entry shifted in order, as if a delayed sync had kicked in, and the name field that had been blank now showed 3 letters before vanishing again, and the phones in their hands felt heavier than metal and lighter than truth all at once, and no one dared blink while the field pulsed. Someone near the serving line laughed without humor and said the system was bait, and the bait was working, and a ripple of yes and no moved through the room with the slow energy of a wave that will not stop until it hits the shore it has been promised since it was born. Maya looked at Ethan and saw the same calculation behind his eyes that sat behind her own, and both of them knew that leadership did not live in answers here, but in the act of standing between a spark and the nearest dry tinder, and both of them held their ground as the heat rose all the same. The crate whispered against the cart again, and the stencil felt like a stare that refused to blink, and a hand reached out from the male side and another from the female side, and both hung there inches from the lid as if the wood could tell them a truth that might not be survivable if found too quickly. The grill above them stopped hissing, and the room became the sound of breath and cloth, and the faint tick that came from a fan that had been unbalanced for longer than anyone could remember, and the stillness felt like a choice rather than an accident, and choices have ways of arriving with debts to collect. The message thread blinked once more, and a new file began to appear in the list, and it carried the words "new angle," and it climbed from a fraction to a larger fraction, and every eye orbited toward the tiny progress bar, as if gravity itself had shifted its allegiance, and the bar crept along like a slow march toward revelation that would not be turned aside. The new angle file finished its slow climb onto their screens, and the last fraction blinked into readiness, and the mess hall leaned together as if pulled by a tide. None of them could resist. The clip opened to a view from the opposite end of the corridor where the training office lived, and the light spilled out in a thin line, and it cut the floor like a chalk mark they could not erase. A reflection ran along the glass of a framed safety notice, and the shape in the hall slid across it with a blur that became clearer when someone dragged the bar backward and then forward inch by inch. The hand came first out of the dark, and it floated into the glow like a fish crossing a beam, and the skin was pale under the light, and the knuckle bore a thin, pale ridge they could not ignore. A sleeve followed, and the fabric showed unit colors that matched more than one person, and the angle kept the face beyond the edge, and the phones drew closer to faces, as if closeness might wrestle clarity out of the grain. Maya pointed without raising her voice and said to pause, and they froze the frame, and the hall froze with it. And she saw the wristband with its faded strip of paint, and she knew 2 people wore that. Band Ethan held up a hand that asked for steady, and his team matched his stillness, and he counted the likely paths the room could take, and none of them ended well if they chose speed over care. A shiver in the audio let them hear the soft pad of keys and the hiss of the vent as air moved past the microphone and someone sucked a breath through their teeth as if air alone might become a clue. They checked the next frame, and the hand pressed a code with a rhythm that felt confident and not frantic, and the last digit hesitated and then fell, and the lock clicked in a way that made everyone tense again. The scar along the knuckle glowed pale against the keypad, and memory rose like warm air in the minds of the ones who had seen a hand like that during training when a rack had slipped and someone had not moved fast enough at the female table. A specialist said she knew a woman with a strap just like that wristband, and at the male table a corporal said he knew a man with a scar in the same place, and the line in the room drew tighter. The score log on the phones jumped, and a time stamp corrected itself as if the system had been waiting for a moment to show its true order, and the change made the back of every neck grow prickly with heat. The cooks traded a look that asked if the doors would open soon, and the keeper of the cart shifted the crate so the stencil no longer faced them, and yet the word hung in the air as if painted there anyway. A soldier near the far wall lifted his phone and used a filter to sharpen the lines, and the frame bit down on the edges, and a patch on the sleeve came into view that could have been any of 3 units in the building. Maya ran through the catalog of details that lived in her head, and she could place elements but not the whole. And that gap felt like the moment when a step onto a rope bridge reveals a sway that may not stop. Ethan tracked eyes across his table and saw a private flick his attention to the end of the bench and back as if the act were a secret, and then do it again, and the repeated motion tossed a flare into his mind. The video advanced another second, and the hand withdrew and the door eased open, and a reflection caught in the safety glass showed a cheek and a jawline that could belong to more than one body in the room. A sound rose in the ceiling like cloth rubbing against cloth, and the speakers let out a soft breath and then went dead again, and the silence fell like a blanket that was too heavy for the heat of the room. The message thread lit with a still frame pulled from the clip and overlaid with an outline around the wristband and a tiny note that named the band as a training issue item issued in limited quantity this quarter. The supply specialist said that only a handful had been checked out, and she rattled off numbers without names, and both squads did the math and came up with lists that overlapped just enough to be dangerous for the peace. At the end of the female bench, a sergeant shifted and her gaze locked on a private at the fringes and at the male. Bench a specialist did the same, and their eyes pointed like compasses to a single point between them. The quiet private sat with his shoulders a touch too square, and his hands below the table, and his tray barely touched the edge as if he had set it down with care while the rest of the room forgot to care at all. Maya took 2 steps into the space, and the room gave to her without argument, and she said to show hands, and the sound of those 2 words moved through the hall like a tide that leaves a shore wet and waiting. Ethan moved as well, and his boots made soft contact with the tile, and he kept his palms open as if to say that force was the last language he would choose, and the first he could still speak if needed. The private slid, one hand up from his lap, and the skin stretched across the knuckles, and a pale ridge traced the length of one, and the scar aligned in the minds of everyone with the frozen frame that glowed on the phones. The hall leaned forward by fractions, and even the fan seemed to pause between ticks, as if it too were counting out the last beats of waiting before the inevitable choice that comes when a fact can no longer hide. Somebody near the cart whispered a name and bit it off, and the sound of the bitten syllable drifted like a paper ash and settled on the lid of the crate where it waited like a spark in dry straw. The new angle clip played on, and the door shut, and the camera held on the empty hall, and then the screen went black, and their reflections stared back at them with faces they barely recognized as their own. Maya looked into those reflections and saw a leader who would not let a room break itself over suspicion, and she held that image steady while the energy at her back vibrated like a wire pulled past safe tension. Ethan read the same pressure in the tilt of shoulders and the set of jaws, and he did not blink when 2 soldiers stepped near the gap with fists half-formed, and he let them see that he had seen and would not move. The private drew his other hand into the light, and the tray edge nicked his knuckle, and a dot of color rose, and now every eye could see the path of the older scar and the new sting bright against it. The ceiling gave a faint click, and somewhere beyond the doors boots struck concrete, and the sound came through like distant thunder that promises rain, whether the field wants it or not, and the field had no vote today. The supply specialist tucked the cart handle to the side and stepped back as if to give the floor to the people who were no longer eating, and she looked at Maya as if to ask whether this was the moment to speak. Maya did not answer out loud because the answer was already moving through the group, like a current, and it was drawing a circle around the quiet private who had been trying to be part of the furniture for too long. Ethan felt the circle close, and he stepped into it with Maya, and in that shared space, their squads rediscovered a line that ran through both of them and maybe had never been cut at all, only tangled. The thread on the phones chimed again with a final still image, brightened to the edge of grain, and the scar on the hand became a white thread laid along skin, and the wristband flashed its 2 colors like a flag carried low at the edge of the window. A shadow drifted past as if something in the hallway had shifted to make room for a team ready to enter, and the motion pulled several heads as if a magnet had been brought near. The private felt those heads and shrank an inch and then stopped shrinking because there was no more to give, and his eyes ticked toward the exit and back toward the phones and finally toward the scar that would not leave him. Maya named the request again with calm and said to stand and to be ready to talk, and the syllables rested on the table between them like objects that could be picked up or ignored at a cost. Ethan mirrored the request and left a lane open that led nowhere. But truth and the room felt that lane appear and clear itself of bodies that would otherwise have been shoved or tripped or dragged. The private placed both hands on the tray, as if that thin rectangle could anchor him to a world that was shifting, and the lip of the tray bit into his palm and the pressure made his breath change. Shape boots sounded beyond the doors again, more distinct this time, and the locks in the frames did a small test on themselves, and the metal tremor ran through the mess hall floor like a warning of arrival. A hush built within the hush, like a new layer laid over an old layer, and above it all, every phone waited with a frozen image that matched the hand now in front of them, and the match was a knot that could not be untied. Maya held his gaze and kept her own steady, and let him see that there was a road out that did not lead through a fight, and that the first step on it would be taken in front of the entire room. Ethan shifted just enough to show he would hold the line if others tried to break it, and several shoulders eased without quite dropping, and the air found a little more room to move, but not much. The private drew a breath that changed his height by a hair in the tray, tilted, and the metal caught the light like the bright edge of the paused video, and the entire hall watched as he began to rise. The audit team flowed in with measured steps, and their tablets glowed like small windows in their hands, and the locks gave a final soft click that felt like a seal, and the mess hall gathered its breath around the center, where Maya and Ethan stood, and Lucas watched the doorway, where the shape beyond the glass shifted, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet been given, and the hush sharpened into something that was almost a blade. A staff sergeant from the audit team spoke with calm that carried without strain and asked for all devices to remain visible and all personnel to hold their seats, and Maya repeated the request with a touch of steel, and Ethan added his weight with a nod, and the small motions traveled outward in a wave, and Lucas lifted his tray a little as if to surrender it, and then stopped, because his eyes were on the shadow at the exit that did not move. The leader of the audit group stepped into the clear zone, and his name tape read Park, and his gaze was steady and not unkind, and he said they would verify the logs and the footage and the scores, and that this would go faster if people helped rather than fought, and the simple sense of it should have eased the room. But it did not, because every mind was hooked by that still figure in the glass. A second team in plain dress stood in the threshold, and the cut of their jackets marked them as agents from the office, whose business was to ask harder questions than most, and the taller of them kept his hands low and empty while his eyes took inventory of the entire space. And when he looked at Lucas, the young soldier fought the instinct to step back and looked instead to Maya as if asking if he should run or stand. Lucas pushed air into his lungs and said he had changed a posted score sheet taped at the training office board and had pushed a rumor into the message thread so that no one would stare at his failure. And he said he had done it alone and had used a code that many people knew, because it had been passed around to make after-hours practice easier, and the words came like stones. And yet, there was one stone he did not lift. Sergeant Park asked him where he had gotten the idea for the rumor with the crate, and Lucas stared at the card as if it might speak and said he had sent a message to the clerk from a borrowed phone telling him to stage the box for a scheduled pickup so that a label would be visible, and the clerk had obeyed a request that looked official, and the clerk lowered his head as if he had been caught in a net that was not entirely his. Maya held the space steady, and told both squads to keep their hands clear and to let the process work, and Ethan marked a lane for the agents to pass, and the cooks stilled their motion as the plain dress pair came fully into the room, and the taller agent said his name was Cole, and that they were tracking a broader pattern in the unit, and that this was not only about one score or one crate or one bad choice, and the words hung there like a stormline agent. Cole asked for the borrowed phone, and Lucas pointed not to his pockets, but to the cart, and the supply specialist blinked and lifted a corner of foam under the top layer where small braces and thick socks lay, and there in the recess sat a cheap black phone that hummed with a battery that should have died long ago. And Cole nodded as if a piece had rolled into a groove, and the room leaned in as if it might see more if it tried hard enough. Park opened an evidence pouch, and the phone slid into it like a fish into a net, and the screen woke and showed the thread that had fed the room for an hour and a half, and the anonymous handle looked brazen under the plain light, and Lucas said that was him, and then swallowed because his voice had gone dry, and he looked at Ethan as if to say this was not the end of the truth he had to pull into the air. Cole did not smile and did not sneer, and said there was another issue because the keypad entry that opened the training office door at midnight had been made from a guest code that no one should have had, and that after the door opened, an admin user had logged in from a desktop that belonged to the timing shop, and that this meant someone else had used the moment Lucas created to make a deeper cut, and the air seemed to thin as the weight shifted. The message thread on several phones blinked again with a new upload push, and a still shot from a camera that was not the corridor angle appeared, and it showed a corner of the timing shop with a reflection on a toolbox, and if one squinted, one could see a patch with the same two colors as the wristband that had become the emblem of this day, and eyes slid sideways toward two people at opposite ends of the same row, and neither moved. Maya spoke softly and asked who had keys to the timing shop after hours, and the cook who ran cleanup duty on that wing raised a hand and said he had a key for only one night, and that night was not last night, and the janitor who had claimed to see a man in the hallway touched his cap and said he had a pass but never used it without a work order, and the supply clerk stared at his shoes as if numbers might line up there to save him, and they did not. Ethan watched the quiet private who had sat near the end of the male bench because Lucas had chosen that spot, and people had orbited it all day, and he saw a second private with the same unit colors on a band and a small scratch on the jaw that could have been a shaving cut and could have been something else. And that soldier kept his phone face down, and his fingertips rested on the edge with a grip that did not quite belong to a relaxed hand agent. Cole gestured gently and asked the phones to be turned over and collected, and a bin moved from the serving line and slid along the aisle like a small boat in slow water, and one by one devices went in, and the second private held on a fraction too long, and then let go, and the screen flickered. A white burst of a lock screen that showed midnight steps counted in a number that did not belong to the story he had told, and heads followed the small arc as it fell. The taller agent asked who had been in the training office the night that the scoreboard had beeped when the fog hung low over the track, and the room knew who had heard that story first, and eyes went to Maya and then to the female specialist who had mentioned it, and the specialist said she had heard the sound and had kept it because it felt like gossip, not evidence, and her cheeks burned with frustration at herself. And yet something in her eyes said she now wanted the full truth pushed out into light. Park tapped his tablet, and doors farther down the corridor opened, and two technicians walked in with a small case, and they raised an antenna, no bigger than a pencil, and the case chirped as it sniffed for signals, and the screen painted heat where devices still talked to the air, and one bright mark glowed near the serving station behind the stack of trays, and the head cook frowned because that was his domain, and he lifted a towel, and under it sat another phone that no one had placed in the bin. The cook said that was not his phone, and he looked more hurt than angry, and Cole lifted it with gloved hands, and the screen lit to the same thread. Under a second handle that had always replied first to the anonymous account, and the cadence in the posts felt like someone who liked to push buttons and watch the results. And Park said they would not chase style, but they would chase sign in, roots. And the case chirped again, as if to agree. Lucas looked smaller now without moving, and he said again that he had started the fire, and that he would accept whatever came, but that he had not unlocked the training office or touched the shop desktop, and that he had been sleeping in his rack at that hour, and that 3 people could vouch for him, and one voice at the mail table said yes, and another said yes, and a third tried to say nothing, but nodded, and the nod landed with the weight of relief and dread together. The second private with the jaw scratch stood very slowly and said he had been on detail and had passed the corridor and had seen the door ajar and had heard the beeping and had looked in because curiosity is a pull that is hard to resist, and that he had stepped away when he saw someone inside and that the someone had not seen him and that he had not wanted to bring trouble that would look like a fight between squads, and his voice slid into the room and landed like a pebble on thin ice. Cole asked him to describe the someone, and the private closed his eyes as if the image lived on the inside, and he said the figure moved like a person who had spent a long time behind a desk, and that the shoulders were a touch uneven, like a bag had been worn too long on one side, and that the wristband was the same colors as theirs, and that the scar he had seen was old and straight, and not from a rack but from a sharp edge, and the hall leaned toward him. For the next word boots sounded again outside, and this time the shape at the glass separated into 2, and the door opened to admit a captain with lines of worry carved into a tired face, and a civilian with a badge on a lanyard, and the captain said that the timing shop desktop had just pinged the network again at an odd hour during the last week, and that the login pattern matched a user who had signed off from admin duty a month ago, and the word ghost moved through the room like a cold breeze. The civilian stepped close and said she was from Network Defense, and that she had been tracking a shadow user across several buildings, and that the pattern often rode on top of small scandals like a bird that waits for insects flushed by a larger animal, and that the fights and the whispers were not the point but the cover, and her eyes went to the crate and then to the 2 phones and then to the bin where all the rest had gone, and the pattern.